What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video and to a new series here on the channel. You see, I'm a big fan of looking back at history in professional sports, esports included. A while back, somebody recommended to me that I take a look at trades that have happened throughout the history of the Overwatch League. The idea is to see who won said trade, or if one team at least benefited more than the other. Trades don't occur all that often in the league, but what's cool is that there has been at least one every single season, and I'm sure more are going to occur in the future, so it's a series we can space out and come back to every so often. I was thinking of starting off with the player for player trades, then maybe looking at the player for money acquisitions later on. To kick off this series, I wanted to discuss the Decay for OGE trade, since that's probably the biggest trade when it comes to player for player the league has ever seen. Let us start off by setting the scene. So both the Gladiators and the Fuel were looking to make some major changes heading into Season 3. After a strong first half of the year in Season 2, OG's caliber of play steadily declined as a member of the Fuel. As Orisa became more relevant in the meta, his impact and consistency kept getting worse quality-wise. He even started suffering from burnout, which only made the situation worse for the Fuel. That play that helped the Fuel make the Stage 4 playoffs in 2018 and Stage 2 in 2019 was nowhere to be seen. Now seemed like as good a time as ever to get rid of him and start over with somebody new lining up next to Note. OGE simply was no longer working out. He didn't synergize with Note well enough, and he just wasn't what he once was. A replacement was needed, which they intended to find through free agency, as we saw when they decided to pursue Gamsu. On the other hand, the Gladiators found themselves at a crossroads. They had a relatively successful season by making the playoffs and even getting out of the first round this time, but even so, there was a clear problem at main tank, because Roar did not develop in the way they hoped he would. Instead of being that young star they needed him to be, he played mediocre at best. What was supposed to be a dynamic duo out of Kondu Panthera became a one-man show with only Decay pulling his weight consistently. But the Gladiators had no interest in keeping Decay either, despite his potential. They were ready for a rebuild in general, to the surprise of many people, including myself at the time. They decided to trade and let most of their roster pursue new opportunities in free agency. Decay's vision suddenly changed despite another fairly good year. It appeared that just being good was not enough. So in an attempt to start fresh and get a new main tank in there, the Glads tried to make a big move, as they tend to do every offseason. I'm not sure what the exact reasoning behind it was, but they took a liking to OG, and originally Dallas were looking to deal OG to Toronto from what I can recall, but the Gladiators swooped in at the final hour with a deal Dallas simply could not refuse. Decay wasn't playing, at least yet, at the godlike superstar level many fans were hoping for in his rookie year, but he was still a great player with limitless potential basically. So when the Gladiators offered Decay for OG straight up, it was a done deal. From the roster standpoint, it wasn't bad at all for either team. The Gladiators get a new main tank to pair up with the newly acquired space, and Dallas gets some needed firepower at DPS, which they were severely lacking during Season 2. But given OG's recent decline, I would say most people at the time considered this trade to be Dallas favored. They gained somebody with immensely more potential, all while sacrificing very little to get him. Even if the Gladiators wanted money as well, we've come to learn that money is no object with a team like Dallas. Keep in mind that the Gladiators also spent a fortune on Decay in a massive bidding war just to get him to begin with. They were willing to trade away one of the most sought-after players in league history so easily. So to see him get casted aside so quickly was questionable and pretty interesting to say the least. But they were desperate for change, so they were willing to take these types of measures. Alright. So as we've established, Dallas was the winner in most people's eyes on paper when the trade initially happened. But what would happen as the season progressed? Well, things were a bit up in the air at first. Despite Decay playing extremely well, it was not really translating into wins. It was a rough 0-3 start for the Fuel. A winless homestand is rough enough on its own, but then there's the fact that they got 3-0'd by the Gladiators, aka the very team they made this blockbuster trade with. Meanwhile, LA were a very competitive team during their first few weeks of the season, even taking down the likes of the Shock and the Valiant, and even pushing the runaway Titans to the brink in week 1. OG's impact was not as great as Decay's, but he was still getting the job done, which made it feel like the Gladiators were winning this trade at first. But as the meta started to shift, and Dallas began to figure it out and gain confidence, the tides quickly turned in their favor. The moments that the Fuel went on that little win streak and pushed the Shock to map 5, it slowly but surely started to look like they were the true winners of this trade. OGE started to lack confidence, and his Orisa just wasn't getting the job done. He'd pick it up a little bit when he could play Winston, but the overall level of play simply was not as reliable as the first couple of weeks of the year. Meanwhile, Decay's play was not suffering in the slightest. If anything, it continued to get more and more insane. I don't think I have to remind any of you of that game versus the Outlaws in the May Melee, or even that time against the Valiant. He was the center point of the Dallas Fuel. The main reason they were winning games and being competitive in their losses was because of his superstar caliber playmaking. In terms of individual performances and their impact on the team, Decay was the clear-cut winner. I think that goes without saying because OGE was nowhere near at Decay's level. But of course, performances in-game and individuality only tells half the story. You can be as good as you want, but it doesn't matter as much as it could if it doesn't really translate into a lot of wins for your team. Now, of course, Decay was not on Dallas for the entire season, and there were some games he did not even play in when he was there, but when you go ahead and calculate the games he was a part of, I believe, if my math was correct, Dallas had a 6-9 record. Just to further measure Decay's impact, Dallas was only able to win 5 games total without him in the game, and many of those games came against the rather easy opponents in the league. Meanwhile, the Gladiators went 14-15 total this year. This includes all playoff and tournament matches. So if you are someone who wants to go off team success and team success only, I suppose the Gladiators were a bit better off. They had the higher win percentage compared to Dallas when using Decay. But I feel like you can't give all that much credit to OGE, who was honestly the second worst starter on the Gladiators last year, only being ahead of Big Goose. So when you think about it, the Glads could have won more if they actually had a more reliable main tank player on their roster. Something I also think is important to keep in mind with the win percentages is strength of schedule. At first I thought for sure that one team probably had it harder off than the other, but what I quickly discovered is that both teams faced a similar number of strong teams in a 15-game span. Keep in mind that I'm comparing the 15 games Decay was a part of with the first 15 games of the year for the Glads. Starting with Dallas, if you exclude those 2 matches with the Gladiators, they had the Valiant twice, the Shock 3 times, plus the Fusion, Mayhem, and Eternal once each. That's a lot of games against top 8 or better teams in the standings. If you want to throw in the games against the Gladiators, then it's even worse. Now compare that to the first 15 games that the Glads had. They had the Shock twice, the Dynasty, the Titans when they were still considered a threat with their runaway roster, the Valiant, the Fusion, and the Eternal. They're pretty similar to one another. The Gladiators tended to have slightly more success against those good teams. However, the Glads had a tendency to drop games against opponents they should not be losing to. Take the 3-1 losses to the Justice and Outlaws, and let's not forget about the embarrassing defeat against Boston. Meanwhile, the Fuel usually took care of business against those types of teams with Decay in the lineup. Given how the Gladiators have the slightly better season though, I can understand if you want to give them the edge in this department. It makes a lot of sense. So that gives one definitive point to the Fuel for getting more out of their player, and one to the Gladiators for having the better record. Even if you take their 15 games, the Glads still have a slightly better win percentage since they go 7-8 over that span. But how do we go about breaking this sort of tie? Well, in my opinion, you have to address the falling out between Dallas and Decay to make a final judgment, because that was pretty massive. Think about it. The Fuel traded for this guy just to part ways with him before the season even came to a close. They essentially got him for a little more than half a season since he played 15 out of their 27 games. That's not very good, and we already are well aware why this happened. Decay was making the situation supposedly worse for the entire team by refusing to practice or scrim. As Crimzo put it, he held the team hostage for months just because he was unhappy. Now, of course, I don't know the full story behind this, and I have no idea what happened to make Decay act this way, but it doesn't look good given all of the people who are saying that he did this type of stuff. So to not only have him cause internal drama, but also leave the team mid-season is a big yikes. OGE might not have had anywhere near the impact that Decay did on games, but at least he stayed out of trouble. He stayed the whole year. OGE was probably dealing with confidence issues among other things, but did that stop him? No, he kept pushing forward. So from that aspect, I would say that it's all the more reason to maybe believe the Gladiators were the true winners of this trade. It sounds ridiculous to think about, but you can't deny how out of hand things got for the Dallas Fuel. This trade brought them nothing but temporary happiness. Meanwhile, the Gladiators played up to their expectations despite them not getting very far in the playoffs. They finished around where most people thought they would. I would say it really does depend on what viewpoint you have though. I for one am kind of neutral. The Fuel got so much more out of Decay. He was their superstar carry who basically kept them in all games by himself a lot of the time. But at the same time, the Gladiators never really imploded and they found more success. But looking at it now in the current day, both teams basically just gave up on the players they traded for. Neither of them became a long-term answer or somebody who changed their team's future for the better for that matter. As far as I'm concerned, Both teams were losers in this trade. The Gladiators got a mediocre main tank who is now on a different team. The Fuel got a DPS who gave Dallas fans hope for about 15 games just for him to cause problems then join a different team. It didn't work out for either side, both long-term and short-term. I genuinely believe that neither team won this trade, but if I was forced to pick a winner in a life or death situation, I would probably choose the Gladiators. Decay's value and impact was astronomically greater than OG's, but he literally did not make it through a full season. A guy that maybe could have helped the Fuel pull off an upset or two in the playoffs was gone before we even got to September. And let's not forget that Dallas literally got eliminated by Decay and the Justice shortly after. Their savior became the man who denied them of winning a single playoff match. He was basically more trouble than he was worth. If Decay was supposedly refusing to practice literally for months, that puts your team in such a poor place synergy-wise and with your overall mindset. It ruins everything. I love what Decay did for the Fuel when he tried and he was there for them, but there were simply too many problems. OG never caused any problems, and he never bailed out on his teammates either. For the simple fact that he was a starter for the entire year and he stayed out of trouble, I would argue that the Gladiators won this trade. Again though, I would say neither team won it if I was given the option to. Neither team truly benefited, end of story. Well, that's pretty much all I have to say in retrospective to the Decay for OG trade. What could have been a promising acquisition for both teams was nothing but a failure. So now I want to hear your take on this. What are your thoughts on this trade, and do you think there was a clear-cut winner, or do you think there was no winner like myself? Let me know down in the comment section. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this type of content. If you're interested in seeing me continue this series and make more in the future, make sure to let me know by giving this video a like and subscribing to my channel if you're new. And as always, thanks so much for watching my content. I really do appreciate all of you so much. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.